here in front of a steam locomotive in Hagerstown, Maryland, also known as the Hub City. The Hub City gets its nickname for the number of rail lines that converged to form the railroad hub in the 19th century during America's industrial era. Bensel talks about the organizational challenges to the evolution towards managerial capitalism, such as vast distances separating centers of supply and demand. This demand for high-volume, long-distance freight was the primary reason behind the expansion of America's railroad network. This challenge would be best met by none other than Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins was born in Maryland on May 19, 1795, and moved to Baltimore in 1812 to work in his uncle's wholesale grocery business. He established a wholesale business of his own in 1819 that was wildly profitable. He used his wealth to invest heavily in the startup Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So with $5 million in initial capital, the first commercial railway in the United States was born. Hopkins' investment in the B&O made him extremely wealthy. He became the director of the B&O in 1847 and the chairman of the finance committee in 1855. Johns Hopkins used his personal wealth to bail the B&O out of debt in 1857, and by 1858, B&O's annual revenues exceeded $4 million. The solvency of the B&O Railroad was a strategic boon to the Union during the Civil War. Hopkins, a Quaker and staunch abolitionist, allowed Abraham Lincoln free use of the B&O during the war. Although B&O earnings were boosted at the conclusion of the Civil War, passenger earnings fell sharply in 1865 and 1866, and reduced freight earnings resulted from Confederate depredations along the B&O line in the early part of the Civil War. Johns Hopkins himself would die on Christmas Eve in 1873, but not before he used his wealth to bail out the B&O one more time. The B&O Railroad would soon become a 1,700-mile system with revenues of nearly $20 million and expanded rapidly with direct connections to Columbus and Pittsburgh in 1871, Chicago and St. Louis in 1893, and Philadelphia in 1895. By 1880, railroad employees consisted of 11% of the entire U.S. workforce. Alas, this overstretch of the great railroad empire would lead to the financial ruin of the B&O, and the railroad would declare itself bankruptcy in 1896. It would amble along in the first part of the 20th century. Still, it was the Great Depression and the decline of Appalachian coal that would signal the end of the independence of the B&O Railroad. Ultimately, the B&O Railroad, this juggernaut, was taken over by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and later merged into CSX in 1987. But that is not the terminus of Johns Hopkins' legacy. In his will, Hopkins set aside $7 million to establish a hospital and affiliated training colleges, an orphanage, and a university. At the time of his death, it was the largest philanthropic bequest in U.S. history. Johns Hopkins was not just a 19th century commercial giant. The institutions that he founded through his philanthropic works had a hand in founding a persistent legacy that are world-renowned to this day. Indeed, Johns Hopkins Hospital brings in revenues of about $2.5 billion. That is quite the legacy produced from railroad investments. I'm Corwin Parker for HIUS 713, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.